Well, I'm joined now by the Chief of Defence General Angus Campbell. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. Let's start with this question about commanders. Do you really believe they had no idea that 39 unlawful killings took place on their watch?
David, thanks for the opportunity to speak with you and to speak with your viewers. It's a very confronting question because it goes to the heart of what is command and what should commanders know. Now, that's what Justice Brereton found. I've looked through his report, and he does start with a question of culture and behaviour and the performance in terms of military discipline, standards and the conduct of work in the military in the way that we would describe as a professional force. These are issues that officers are responsible for and higher commanders must ensure are being applied. Then into the field, we see what Justice Brereton speaks of as a warrior culture, and he does say that here some officers have had an influence in that coming into certain parts of our force and being magnified and exemplified by some individuals at the patrol commander level. Again, officers and higher command have a role, indeed a responsibility, with regard to how units perform, the behaviours they exhibit, the discipline and the culture. And then Justice Brereton speaks to the question of whether the command and control arrangements for directing and controlling the special operations task groups in Afghanistan were sufficient. And he finds them too dispersed and too distant, dispersed in authorities and distant geographically to have that immediacy of grip that he suggests we should ensure in future coalition operations Australia maintains. I see layers of responsibility here, David, and that's why it's going to take a little while to work through this report, its recommendations, and to thoroughly implement it. I am determined to see deep, comprehensive and enduring change where it's needed.
It's a bit more specific than that, though, too. I mean, the Brereton report does say, and I quote, commanders indirectly contributed to the criminal behaviour by sanitising or embellishing reporting to avoid attracting questions. It also refers to a culture of silence within Special Operations Command, the deliberate undermining, isolation and removal of some individuals who tried to address the rumoured conduct. I mean, we're talking here, General, aren't we, about commanders hiding the truth and punishing those who spoke up. Who will ultimately be held accountable for this?
So, David, you're right. I'm not in any way trying to downplay all of the detail of that report, and what you've outlined is exactly right. He does highlight that there are officers in command roles in the Special Operations Task Group and indeed in higher appointments who had a responsibility to deal with issues and to completely and openly report. And he finds fault there, and I accept that. And in terms of responsibility and then accountability, that's part of the issue of dealing with and working through on a case-by-case basis exactly what happened and who's to be held to account. Ultimately, I'm going to be held to account to make sure that this report is dealt with thoroughly, and I'm held to account also for my duty and my performance in the Middle East as the commander in the Middle East in 2011. I think you'll find that there is no shortage of officers, senior non-commissioned officers and soldiers who are looking at this report and reflecting on their part in this story. And it's not a good story at all.
What about the legal officers attached to those forces? The report says they contributed to embellishing operational reports and saw their role as acting for Special Forces members. Complaints from the Afghan government, the Red Cross, other human rights groups were dismissed. This sounds a bit like a cover-up in part, doesn't it?
David, I read it as a slow erosion and then ultimately a suborning of what are meant to be independent review processes, so that instead of a mechanism to ensure that patrol reporting was correctly reviewed from a law of armed conflict perspective, we see in Justice Brereton's report that over time this governance work was no longer rigorous, no longer independent. And yes, there is accountabilities there too. Could I just say that while I am absolutely clear on the failings and the inadequacies that this report outlines, there is an enormous amount of good work by men and women of very good intent that contributed to Australia's story in Afghanistan for almost 20 years, and it continues today. I don't diminish the seriousness of what we're dealing with. I equally don't want to diminish the value and the honour of that work.
Well, and I want to come to that in a moment. Can I ask you about one other specific recommendation in the report? It says the wearing and use of an appropriate helmet camera or body camera by Special Forces operators on operations should be mandated. Will all Special Forces now be required to wear body cameras at all times? How will that work? What will happen with that footage?
So, David, we're now going to work through exactly that kind of recommendation. I think it's a very good idea. It creates a degree of objectivity and a capacity for both learning, development and record keeping. That is a separate pathway to other review mechanisms which also need to be strengthened, and he recommends that as well. And that material would then become a digital archive, permanently and securely held, so that if claims were to arise, they would be able to contribute to understanding what may have happened.
Were Special Forces relied upon too heavily in Afghanistan? This is touched on in the report. It says Special Forces should not be treated as the default force of first choice. Were they doing too much work that regular forces could have been doing?
David, you're right to say that Special Forces have been very busy over the last 20 years. And they've had a very wide range of roles and responsibilities and operational commitments. In terms of their role in Afghanistan, there were aspects right from the start and all the way through that campaign which necessarily had to be done by a Special Forces capability. But there are other elements that Justice Brereton refers to that, in hindsight, perhaps we should have seen rotated to other elements of the force earlier.
Was that a political decision or a defence decision?
No, I think that Justice Brereton is also quite right in saying the ADF planned operations, the ADF conducted operations, the ADF provided advice to government on operations. I want the ADF to acknowledge that this is something we've got to own, because if we don't own it, we won't fix it. And if we don't fix it, this horror may appear again, and I just cannot accept that.
Well, finally, on this question of legacy in Afghanistan, I mean, this comes at a time nearly 2 decades on since we first went there, at a time when the US is now drawing down more of its forces, at a time when the Taliban is looking stronger than it has for a long time. Yes, we did do a lot of good for the people in Uruzgan in particular, but now this legacy includes alleged war crimes by Special Forces. At the end of the day, was this war worth it for Australia?
David, that's something that's a judgment for the people of Australia. But I'd remind the people of Australia what we did and why we went there. We went there to prevent Afghanistan being a base for international terrorism. We went there with another 50 countries. We worked to develop the Afghan National Security Force, to fight the Taliban forces and to offer reconstruction opportunities and the development of the civil government in Afghanistan. There is a very considerable legacy there, to the point where now you see that government in negotiations to find a way to peace for a country that's been ravaged by war for almost 40 years. I think that's an important contribution that Australia has made, and I just say to our veterans, be proud of what you've done, because you have made a difference to the lives of Afghans. Equally, be open and be clear and be honest about what has happened and how we all need to pull together to fix it. And if you need any assistance, please contact those welfare and help support agencies that are available.
General Angus Campbell, appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, David.